It is Friday, December 13th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Game of the Year episode of LTPS. We, of course, have the Game Awards to go over from last night, but also various things going on in the PlayStation landscape as well, so a lot to cover. Let's begin, as always, with our PS Plus reminder. A very brief reminder, make sure you claim the December lineup for the essential games, and then also we have the PS Plus Extra and Premium lineup announced and going live on PSN this coming Tuesday on the 17th, which for PS Plus Extra, we have Sonic Frontiers, Forspoken, one of those early high-profile Square exclusives on PlayStation 5. Definitely the kind of game where it might be better to just play that with subscription instead of paying for it. You might be pleasantly surprised, or it might not be for you and you can just put it down right away. You've also got Fist, Forged, and Shadow Torch, one of those early China Hero games as well. I'm a big fan of Coffee Talk Episode 1 and Episode 2, Hibiscus and Butterflies. Such a good, cozy visual novel game. I love those games dearly. You've also got A Space for the Unbound, Fogs, and Biped. Going into PS Plus Premium, though, we have the 3 titles that they already announced, that being Sly 2, 3, and Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy. No bonus titles here, so we've only got those 3, and then the additional extra one here that's not a classic game per se, but we have Star Wars Tales from the Galaxy's Edge PSVR 2, which that game I know is quite expensive physically now, so at the very minimum, you can get that through Premium, so not too bad there. I was hoping we'd see a few more extra classic games before the year closes out, but those 3 were already available on PSN, which I've not had the chance to look into this too much, but apparently Sly 1 was recently updated, and it seems like it might have seen a resolution boost, so the game is just a little bit sharper, which is good considering the sort of initial complaints with the updated PS2 emulator is that the games still don't really look all that good, and the emulation is just kind of, you know, serviceable for the time being. But we've seen Implicit Conversions has been sort of rolling out various updates over time across all these games, whether it's new titles they're listing on PSN or going back to the previous titles they've already shipped. So in that case, it seems like it's good that they're, you know, slowly going back and fixing or addressing some of the complaints and problems so far. And so in that case, I would hope that Sly 1 and then 2, 3, and haven't had the chance to boot up Jak and Daxter. I will surely do that at some point, but to improve those PS2 games and spruce them up even more. Moving on to our first proper news story, PlayStation 2024 wrap-up is now finally available on PlayStation.com, which I do say that confidently because when the wrap-up page went live on the 10th, it was down, and it was in maintenance for like, I think over a day, so possibly up to 2 days. Yeah, it would have been 2 days, right? Because we're up the 13th now, and it only just started working yesterday. So it was down for a little bit, but PlayStation Wrap-Up is now available. You can punch in your PSN ID, get some stats and a breakdown of the kind of games you've been playing and things like that. So it's interesting that this year in particular, it seems like it was down the longest because the past 2-3 years, it was always seeing problems, but typically, if I remember correctly, they always got it fixed up in like, you know, a few hours, maybe the following day. But this year, they just could not seem to get this thing in order, but it should now be available. You can check out your stats on PlayStation.com. Moving on to some Astro Bot news, a very pleasant surprise here, but we do have a bonus Festive DLC level, which is now available to play for the game as well. So this is something where I have not had the chance to start this up just yet, but it does appear to be its own little Christmas-themed level, so you can walk around, save some more special VIP bots, and this seems like a more traditional platforming level, not one of the sort of speedrun gauntlet-style levels. So that was announced not too long ago, and now it's already live on PSN. So loving the extra Astro Bot content here, all the free updates that we've been seeing for the game, and I will not say no to more content for this game. That is a fact. Moving on to some Bend Studio news, where we had a bit of an oopsie going on from a former UI designer at the studio, where their time at the company, they had some material on their online art portfolio, which was meant to be resume stuff, obviously, but that did show off some screenshots and one video of their work at the studio, which means we now saw some early concept screenshots from this game, which Bend has been working on this title since at least 2022, could be potentially earlier, depends on the timeline and based on when they chose to confirm these things. But essentially what happened here was this was reported on by MP First, where again, online art portfolio of a UI designer was discovered. They worked at Bend from 2022 until March of this year, but we did get a handful of screenshots and concept art from Ben's game. Now, I should clarify that I can't show anything because SIE did send a DMCA takedown notice to MP First, but what we can describe here, and I'm sure a lot of you also probably saw this in time, but it does appear to be a third-person shooter with military elements just based on the character model and the weapons looking a bit more grounded in reality. And there was this kind of hub room area in one of the screenshots showing off different areas being labeled as hub director, wardrobe, rank, transfer section A, just certain elements that would imply maybe this is a hub world sort of stage that you can walk around. And based on hearing hub director, wardrobe, rank, these are things that might be multiplayer live service elements. And so while there is some initial concerns there, it's important to clarify, obviously, that, 2022 on the PlayStation blog is when Ben formally announced that they would be working on a new IP with multiplayer based on the open world systems that they established in Days Gone. This was around the same time, I should say, where they showed off their new company studio logo as well. So this has already been very well-known public info. Even prior to this, honestly, it's something where, the studio always wanted to do multiplayer. This was when they were developing Days Gone, and they wanted to have multiplayer elements in that game as well. So I know this is one of those things early on where people tend to pick up the pitchforks, more acai live service nonsense, but this studio in particular, for a very long time now, we know wanted to have a multiplayer component for their games. Another very important caveat here to consider is that we did have the recent 2024 business segment briefing where SIE had that studio breakdown of all their teams, and they were being categorized in different areas, right? Different genres, different sort of specializations. And so for Bend, they were categorized as evolving/multi-genre. And that category also included Guerrilla Games, which is a multi-team studio, which is going to have single player and also multiplayer games in there as well. Polyphony, where GT7, obviously I think most people would safely consider that probably a live service game, even though in prior years Sony would not consider them live service. But, GT7 is the kind of game where you can absolutely play that on your own time. Media Molecule with Dreams, and them probably doing something very similar in scope probably, but maybe a bit more grounded as far as it being more of a consumer-facing single-player thing. But I think you get the point, right? It's sort of a evolving multi-genre title that does make sense, and that it's a little bit more loose with what kind of experience they could be crafting. Whereas on the opposite end, we had Bungie, San Diego Studios, Haven, Firewalk, Neon Koi, those two now closed, but they were firmly in the live service categorization there. So there's obviously concern. What I will say is that it makes sense. I mean, this is exactly what the studio already said, and based on when they did openly announce this, which was 2022, this game is still probably, I would say, not in its infancy, but we always, sometimes we mistakenly assume that, okay, 2 years have gone by, they've got to be far along enough on this thing to maybe we'll see it in another 2-3 years, but that always assumes that development is going well. So I would still expect this is probably a back half life cycle PlayStation 5 game. Well, we're already in the back half, but rather probably something a little bit further, right? 2026 and beyond. But it does seem to, it's shaping up to be what I would have expected from Bend as far as if it will be more military grounded, and we still don't know if there's going to be certain elements beyond the scope of what might be a more bog standard military game, but it is a new IP as well. Where I fall on this is, okay, we got some decent insight into maybe what they're crafting, but it still really doesn't tell you enough about this game. And so with that in mind, I'll be patiently waiting for when Ben gets to start talking about these games, or this game, I should say, on their terms, which is always the important thing to consider. All right, let's move on to the 2024 Game Awards from last night, where it was a very long show, but I think it would be somewhat safe to say this was one of the best Jeff Keighley affairs we've had in a very long time. Pretty good pacing. I mean, it was a long show, obviously, and RIP to anybody that was in Europe, because that's always bad timing for you. But generally, it did seem like they were light on the full-blown advertisements, but mixing in genuine, exciting announcements from third parties, and PlayStation was there as well, which we'll talk about in a second. But a nice celebration of studios and developers, big and small, that were able to spend enough time talking on stage when they were accepting awards. And there's just so much to really unpack on the entire thing, and we clearly can't go over the entire thing. So we'll just fire off some of the very fast, just like big announcements that are not directly PlayStation related per se. Borderlands 4 gameplay was there. Onimusha Way of the Sword was announced. The Witcher 4 got an extended CG trailer. Fumito Ueda showed off their next game. It's untitled right now, but that was a really big deal, and actually Epic is the one publishing that title, so seems like kind of a, I want to say a miss from SIE, but clearly it was something where they chose to not do that a long time ago. But Gen Design's next game is got a formal reveal, even though again it doesn't have a name. And then Okami is getting a sequel. I know a lot of people out there probably thought that game was never happening. So a lot of really big stuff, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some, to be honest with you, because it just ended not that long ago. But when we talk about like direct SIE announcements, we'll cover up those right now. Starting off with one that actually was a little bit surprising to me. I thought this was just kind of a standard affair thing that Sony was maybe partnering up with this game, but it's the announcement of Midnight Murder Club. It's the 6-player shoot-in-the-dark experience. Kind of a weird pitch, but you're basically set in a very big, like completely dark environment, this big mansion, and the only light source comes from a flashlight piercing through the darkness, or if there's gunfire. So the whole idea is you can use your flashlight to find somebody, but then that gives away your position. That's going to be PS5 and PC crossplay, with the crossplay beta available right now. And the thing is, PC requires a PSN account. When I saw that like right during the reveal, I'm like, oh, that seems really strange. So they must be publishing this game, which that is going to open up a whole new can of worms if anytime Sony is publishing a PS5 and let's say PC day and date multiplayer title, now it's not even so much a matter of like, oh, a Sony property that the company is shipping from PlayStation Studios. No, it's any sort of publishing agreement that they have with games on PC, they're going to require a PSN account. So I thought that was noteworthy, but that game is going to be going into early access February 2025. And then after that, we had Helldivers 2, new content dropping immediately. That's Omens of Tyranny, now live. The Illuminate have returned, which are the super advanced, highly intelligent beings wielding powerful technology. And later on, after on the PlayStation blog, this is where Sony did confirm the special Helldivers 2 DualSense controllers, which we heard about from Bilbo Kuhn. So those have been shown off as well. So pre-orders for those start on December 20th, and that's going to launch on February 6th, 2025. And also a special Helldivers 2 vinyl soundtrack is being worked on as well. After that, we had The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered for PC finally confirmed, which is the most run-of-the-mill kind of expected, and it would probably show up during a Jeff Keighley show announcement, but it is confirmed. That's coming April 3rd, 2025 to Steam and the Epic Game Store. And interestingly enough, this time around, they've brought in Nixxes to work alongside Naughty Dog and Iron Galaxy for this PC port, which we have seen prior with Iron Galaxy and Naughty Dog doing these PC ports in-house and in collaboration with Iron Galaxy. There's been some issues, so considering Nixxes is right there as the specialty PC porting house, it would make sense to employ them for this job, have them oversee this, and make sure this thing gets out the door in a nice, competent manner. So good to see that. But going into the final big announcement for the TGAs, which Jeff did actually pull a one last thing here, because initially he said, oh, this is the last announcement, which led into Okami, which that on its own was a very big deal. But after that, and then right before the Game of the Year announcement, he did say, oh, wait, we've got one more thing, and it led into Naughty Dog's new IP being revealed, Intergalactic: The Heretic Prophet, which, as many might remember, we actually did see the copyright filing for this game, and the speculation at the time was, oh, maybe it's Santa Monica's game, or it could be Naughty Dog's. It is Naughty Dog's, their new sci-fi IP in development for PlayStation 5. We have some extra details here from the PlayStation blog, so let's go over that. The protagonist is Jordan A. Munn, a bounty hunter who ends up stranded on Semperia, a distant planet whose communication with the outside universe went dark hundreds of years ago, and anybody who travels there is never able to leave. Now, Naughty Dog is not saying a whole lot about the story right now, but they are committing to it being an emotional, character-driven journey, and on top of all that, they do say it will be their deepest gameplay in Naughty Dog's history. The protagonist is also played by Tati Gabrielle, and they'll reveal more of the cast members later on. And as for the musical score, they're working with Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. They've also been working on this game since 2020. So big stuff. We finally have Naughty Dog's new IP, which, you know, on its own, building up to this moment, obviously there's been some Naughty Dog fatigue in terms of how it's been a lot of The Last of Us, a lot of ports or remasters. We saw them, you know, waste a lot of time, admittedly, on a multiplayer game that never is going to see the light of day. And there was hundreds of staff on that particular game, which I think is the easy way to sort of, I guess, look at this game and maybe set expectations as far as when it would arrive. My initial gut thinking here, because they're not really saying a whole lot now, I guess the reason why they would put out there that, yes, we've been working on this since 2020, is that they maybe want to, I guess, set the record straight, and that this is not going to be like a 2028 game. But I'm also thinking it's probably not next year, obviously. It's likely, I would say, a 26 or 27 game. I mean, we do have to remember we don't necessarily know what the studio hierarchy was with where they were funneling people in from one project to another. We can't always safely assume that, you know, 4 years means it was 4 years in full production. That's obviously not the case. So it could have been a year of like just a handful of people really starting this thing, figuring out what it's going to be, and then production really ramping up. And it wasn't only until, you know, late last year that a lot of staff were then freed up from the Last of Us multiplayer. So it's always something to sort of bear in mind when we talk about these games and how long they've been in development. But the read to me is that maybe we can see this thing by 26 or 27. And I've always thought, like, at the very least, we'll probably see, you know, a formal announcement of this game sooner rather than later, but it might not fit the criteria of what I've heard from other first-party teams, and that some studios don't want to say anything about their game until they feel a lot more confident that they're going to hit their internal release targets, which could be a certain quarter, a certain year. That would be like a Ghost of Yotei, but in this case, we can clearly see they're not labeling any year on this game, so the safe presumption probably is it's at the very minimum a 2026 game and beyond. But that's really not even the important part here, just that it's still a really crazy thing to now say out in the open. We have Naughty Dog's new IP. It's sci-fi. It's so very different for the studio. The trailer was so cool, and yeah, I'm sitting there watching it, and I'm thinking to myself, like, oh man, is this it? Am I really watching this right now? It's so different, right? And I can't wait to see more of it. Who knows when that will be? But it was like, just like, there's already little nods and things in the trailer. I've only seen it twice now. I'm going to see it a lot more times. But having like the Sony logo in there, it's like, oh, well, that's for sure what's going on here. There's other brands in there too, like Porsche and Adidas. And so I'm sure there's a lot of fine details to cherry pick out of that trailer. And then towards the end, where you've got the actually a very classic colored PlayStation logo, which may very well be a nod to the 30th anniversary. But actually, another observation I had immediately is, like, I don't think we had one SIE title or announcement that was introduced with a PlayStation Studios logo. I could be wrong. I'd have to look back at the stream or something, but I almost feel like that would be not Sony walking away from the PS Studios branding. Obviously, they'll do that on YouTube and when you launch games all day, every day. But maybe during live events like this, they want to keep the audience guessing while they're watching. And so not displaying that PS Studios logo as an immediate giveaway of like, oh, it's a PlayStation Studio developer, or at the very least some sort of external team that gets the PS Studios branding from that point of view. But man, still crazy to see. We have it out there, out in the open, the Heretic Prophet, Intergalactic Heretic Prophet. That's going to be a mouthful to start saying now. But yeah, that was that was awesome to see. Now, capping off the TGAs, we of course have to mention the actual awards themselves, which we can't go over every single category here, but with this being LTPS, we'll mention some of the categories that SIE was able to bring home a win. And so Helldivers 2, very happy to see that Arrowhead was able to bring home Best Multiplayer and Best Ongoing Game. Huge congrats to Arrowhead, because that game really did take over everybody's life for a month and a half. And now they've got new content out there too, so really good stuff. But Astro Bot, I will say, like, as a joke, when the night began, I was like, oh, here comes the Astro Bot sweep, because it won Best Family Game, but it went on to win Best Game Direction, Best Action Adventure, and indeed Game of the Year, which, I mean, I think I've said before in prior LTPS episodes, but it's like, I know it's going to win many awards across various publications. This particular event, I didn't really think that was going to happen, and I'm very pleased to say I was wrong. You can see Nicolas Duché was maybe also a little bit taken aback. He probably himself was not expecting the overall win to go to Team Asobi for their work on this very precious, fantastic 3D platformer. I'm just so happy for Team Asobi and them bringing home that award. Especially because, like, Nicolas Duché, very classy speech that he did end up giving about we all grew up on Mario, and so a very nice nod to the OG platformer there, and just, I don't know, I mean, that's really, there's no other way to put it. Like, it's a fantastic, just fun, platforming, colorful game that in many ways has gone against the grain of what the industry has seen a lot of in the past 5, 10 something years. I mean, these are certain games and categories that, like, it's Nintendo, and that's really all it's ever been for a very long time. I don't want to, short sell some of the other 3D platformers we've had in recent years, but we just don't really see enough of it, and certainly not from a higher publisher level. So this was just a really good thing, and it could perhaps maybe set a new, I don't want to say precedent, but it should maybe be aired out there a little bit more to other publishers, and certainly Sony. I think Sony gets the picture well and clear here. They're happy to bring home this award on what is their 30th anniversary year, I should say, but it should send a message for a lot of big publishers and the bean counters behind the scenes of, like, this is the kind of title that has some demand out there. It can earn some prestige, and let's hope that the messaging is clear with Astro Bot bringing home this kind of award. Next up, we have a minor but still not inconsequential update for Sony's possible acquisition of Kadokawa, where we're just now hearing from Sony's side that yes, there is indeed interest there. We've already heard from Kadokawa that they've confirmed they've received a letter of intent from Sony for acquisition, but in this case, we're now hearing from Sony. This was being reported on by Yahoo Japan, where a weekly Japanese magazine got a quote from a Sony representative that states, and I quote here, "It is true that we have expressed our initial intentions of acquiring Kadokawa. We would appreciate it if we could refrain from commenting further." Apparently, too, employee sentiment at Kadokawa is positive about the acquisition, since it would be a big change in leadership and how the company is expected to run, because Kadokawa did have that recent cybersecurity breach, and the company leadership did not really take care of the employees all that well for what was very sensitive information that was being leaked out, and so there seems to be some general sentiment at Kadokawa that they would actually be in favor of a Sony acquisition. But just in this case, we are hearing that from Sony's point of view, yes, we are looking to do this, and we don't want to say much else. So we've now got the two very open interests from the companies. We've had that one Bloomberg report about how the interest was always there, and just they weren't really meeting eye to eye on how much commitment Sony would have for the entire organization, and so there's been a lot of back and forth. But what we can probably say at this point is the waiting game of this either happens and it's not really surprising at this point, or it fizzles out and nothing happens. Or rather, maybe Kadokawa has interest from, say, another buyer, but it would just not really be surprising at all if we do see this end up happening. I think the bigger conversation and curiosity we can propose here is simply, what does a Sony-owned Kadokawa look like? Because there are a few different ways this can go, and usually bigger consolidation like this is not always going to look too pretty, but again, there are Japanese labor laws in place to where they can't necessarily go about this in the same way they would in the West. But there's just, we'll leave it there for now, and we'll talk more about how this would end up looking once it is or is not confirmed. Moving on to some spicy information about a long-lost PlayStation exclusive, and I'm of course talking about Wild for PlayStation 4. Which this game, it was announced back at Gamescom 2014 as an early PS4 exclusive. It was this very interesting sort of survival game where you're playing as this tribalistic protagonist, and you could interact and talk with animals to where you can then control them. Very interesting gameplay premise, and it was one of those early PS4 console exclusives that was supposed to be a pretty big deal, and the game never happened, obviously. It's something that's been kind of well documented because the game's director, Michel Ancel, left the game's industry in 2020, but even after that happening, he said the game was still coming, and then back in August of this year, we heard that the studio is not actively working on it anymore, and now we're finally hearing about what went wrong on this game from, again, Michel Ancel, speaking with Super Poivre. He said back in 2018 that they did have a playable version of this game, but it was taking a long time to upgrade the game to PlayStation 5, so we do know at the very minimum the game was probably going to be cross-gen, and they still intended on releasing it, but this was also around the time where Sony's management side was changing, and so the game was stopped. And so apparently during that time, what happened from that point onward is that Ubisoft offered to take over the entire thing, but Sony did still want to publish it, so they offered to double the game's budget, and the studio couldn't accept that because they were already in the advanced contracts with Ubisoft, and they just couldn't really do anything from that point on. And so at that point, Michel left, and he was not able to defend the scope and the direction of the game, so Ubisoft's editorial department in Paris stepped in, asked for a lot of changes, and then it was just a much different game from the initial pitch, and it all kind of crumbled from there. So we now have, for the most part, the story on what went wrong with Wild. Sometimes it really does take that long to finally figure out what went down with, like, what eventually became Vaporware, obviously. And, you know, Wild was, at the time, a very early, high-profile PS4 game that was going to be exclusive. It looked really interesting, really unique and different, and there was always that hope as every year passed by that, like, is this game still coming? Is it still coming? And we would always get drip-fed occasionally the sort of reassurance of, yes, it's still coming, we're still working on it. I think the final nail in the coffin was when Michel Ancel left the games business, and yeah, as he said, he was not able to really sort of be a staunch defender of the project, which, I mean, gosh, that happens so often with certain projects and games that are kind of tied up in limbo. There's always at least one person, like, on a project or some sort of initiative at the company. It's like once they leave, the entire thing sort of falls apart. And with Ubisoft, historically, this is also pretty well documented, where at times they can have this department sort of step in and sort of overly scrutinize what a game is supposed to be and really sort of change the creative vision. And so it's just very problematic, and in this case it seems like they were probably what ended up killing Wild in the end. Also really surprising that Sony was like, they really wanted to publish this game, stepping in to double the budget. Also not the first time we've heard this, where in some cases, if Sony believes in the vision for a particular project, they will foot that bill and really make sure it gets over the finish line, which you got to appreciate sometimes. So in this case, Wild just was not meant to be, and I'm still hoping we eventually hear what's going on with Deep Down on PlayStation 4 as well. That's another early PS4 announcement in the very early montage trailer for the console, where we did not even have a hardware design. I'd love to see what's going on with Deep Down as well, but and we've heard some things, but yeah, there you go. That's what went down with Wild. In other Ubisoft news, we also have their studios now cleaning up their PSSR implementation on PS5 Pro, where, as we talked about last week, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora had some issues with their PSSR implementation, where it was one of those games that was showing some shimmering artifacts, some weird visual noise when in motion. And so the weird thing about this game, Star Wars Outlaws, Jedi Survivor, I believe Silent Hill was the same thing, but it's a matter of, like, when there's a PS5 Pro mode, certain studios have the option of, like, just kind of doing whatever. They can put in as many modes as they want or as few modes as they want. In this case, you boot up these games and you're only playing on one Pro setting. You can't access the old modes or turn off PSSR. And so recently, both studios of Avatar and Star Wars Outlaws have deployed their hotfix, where you can now disable PSSR, go back to, say, FSR, and you can also access the old modes as well, so the old base performance and quality modes for the time being, as they sort of figure out how to address the issues with PSSR, because this is still not quite isolated. Obviously, we've seen, I think, 4 games now at this point that clearly do have a few issues as far as what version of PSSR they might be using. It is an AI upscaler. We know it is going to get better over time, but in this case, we are seeing a few studios perhaps using an earlier version and just having to work out some of those growing pains, as we say. You know, conceivably, this won't be a problem long term, and we've already seen a number of PS5 Pro patches that look incredibly good on the new console. So in this case, a sort of best practice here should be that PSSR is optional, and don't remove the base modes if there is this fringe case of, like, oh, turns out the 1.0 patch with PSSR is not going to look all that good. All right, moving on to some PSVR 2 news here, where we're hearing both Sony and Apple are partnering up to offer the Sense controllers from PSVR 2 and making those compatible on the Apple Vision Pro, the very expensive Apple Vision Pro, but it would be something where this deal now means that Sony would begin selling the Sense controller separately on Apple's website and also at Apple retail stores as well. So this was initially reported on by Bloomberg, where there has been this agreement in place for at least a few weeks, and this was supposed to be confirmed a few weeks ago, but the rollout has been postponed because it's been a month of work from Sony's end to get the controllers working on the Vision Pro, and then Apple has been reaching out to developers, seeing if they want to update their games to use their controllers, or rather the Sense controllers in this case, because the Vision Pro was initially pitched as this device where you don't necessarily need controllers or any kind of input method outside of just your hands, which is a very interesting and also good and viable VR experience, VR AR experience. Apple will always say it's, spatial computing in a sense, but this is a very smart play in my book because, as you all know, big advocate of virtual reality, but I'm also an advocate of this needs to be a rising tides lifts all boats scenario. Every company needs to collaborate with each other. They need to make sure there's this commonly accepted input method, and controllers should be compatible across a range of devices, and we need to make this extremely viable for studios that are developing in the VR space, make it incredibly easy to ship games on not just one headset but all headsets, because there is an accepted tracking standard and there's a feature set and library in place across all these headsets that is just very conducive to a not only developer-friendly environment, but a consumer-friendly one as well. In the case of a PlayStation user, the weird thing with PSVR 2 this entire time has been if you break a Sense controller, you're kind of SOL. Sony has not sold them separately for over a year now at this point, so it's kind of strange that we needed this deal to happen for that to finally be a thing, and I'm not even sure if this would be a matter of them being, let's say, exclusive to Apple's website. In the grand scheme of things, I guess it doesn't really matter as long as you can actually buy them from somewhere and it's available globally, so you're not, barred from buying this in maybe a certain country or something. So as long as they are available separately, then that's good news. But as far as what this means for VR from both Sony and Apple's perspective, I think it's a good play, especially for Apple, where, the Vision Pro is extremely expensive, sure, but Apple has never been shy with, partnering up with certain companies for officially licensed or officially supported peripherals with their products, and so Apple will always sort of offload this stuff to other companies if they need to, and they've had a pretty good relationship with Sony. The DualSense has always been a well-known controller on Apple's retail site. They approve of that controller for, iPad or iPhone, Mac gaming, things like that, so they've got a pretty good relationship there, and I think this does bode well for VR, AR, and just these two companies trying to alleviate pressures across the spectrum here. Moving on to a very impressive update from the RPCS3 team, the team, of course, responsible for emulating PlayStation 3 on PC, and they've hit a very big milestone here. They made the announcement that RPCS3 is now running on ARM64 hardware, and also native support for Apple Silicon is running as well, and they were also able to get the emulator running on a Raspberry Pi 5, which the big caveat here, obviously, as you can see from the footage, is that the games are running at a resolution of 273p, but they did demo this by showing off games like Folklore, God of War Collection, and Catherine, all running on the Pi, and it's running better than you would think. It really is just truly impressive stuff. It's silly looking with the low resolution, but still, it's a fascinating thing to see play out. But with this conversation, of course, it always dials back to, wow, I can't believe what a group of hobbyists are doing without PS3 source code, and they're able to get it to run on, hardware that has no business running PlayStation 3 games, or rather emulating them, I should say, which oftentimes you need a big CPU overhead for the complicated cell processor. We've always been down this rabbit hole many, many times, and I never want to undermine the kind of work that's gone into long-term what RPCS3 has done. They've made incredible progress. There's absolutely no doubt about it. I agree, it's incredible, and it's also very important work as well, because they're preserving the playability of those titles on platforms beyond aging PlayStation 3 consoles out there. But I digress. The point is, we always still want to rationalize, how has this not happened just yet from Sony's point of view? Why are they not building an emulation layer? And the thing is, as I've said before, if they're doing it, it's something where it's going to be a very long multi-year process, but Sony is a company, they have to monetize it. And as funny and silly and cool as it is to see, our PCS3 running on a Raspberry Pi 5, they're not going to ship a game like that, clearly. There's a difference between doing something because it's cool and we want to push boundaries, and then it's like, oh, we have to make a viable product here that we can then sell to you, monetize. We have to put resources into it. And again, PS4 just is likely not going to be able to get a lot of those PS3 games running. PS5, maybe for a lot of third-party titles, but first-party is always going to be more problematic because those teams leaned more into the cell processor, the SPEs. I mean, it's so many things we've already said before. So it's always going to be a problem. Having said that, I do find that going into PlayStation 6, if they are not already, that would be the console where an emulation layer with enough CPU overhead is probably where PlayStation 3 games could maybe be more reliably emulated, especially given that Sony does have source code. But there still is the problem of monetizing it, QAing each game to be recertified and sold back on the store. And at that point, you have to really cherry pick certain games. And at that point, there's also the license hurdle as well. Now, a lot of first-party titles, obviously, that would make the most sense. Especially with also PS3 server blades likely not going to be, they are surely not going to be staying online forever, right? They were made 10 plus years ago. They're probably incredibly inefficient with power. And so we're saying the same thing over and over and over again, but these things have simply not changed in face of what our PCS3 is able to accomplish. That's really the point I'm trying to get across here. So with that in mind, I will be hopeful going into PlayStation 6 or pleasantly surprised with PlayStation 5. But if it ever did happen on PlayStation 5, it would be very few titles. And I think that's the important thing to consider right now as we see a very slow, handcrafted rollout for what has been PS1, 2, and PSP titles. If you think it's been slow on that end, it would be even slower on PlayStation 3. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are some of the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all. And we had a new episode of PSR, a PlayStation retrospective on Tornado Outbreak, a game that came out on PS3, 360, and Wii. Very weird, quirky, but also super fun game. And if you are a Sly Cooper fan, then definitely check out that game. There is a connection there, which is very fascinating to learn about. And then we also had a sort of an upgrading to PS5 Pro tips and tricks, setup, transition style video, more of an evergreen thing for the channel to sit on. So you don't normally have to go check that one out, but if you're in the interest of getting a PS5 Pro soon, then that is a great way to get some insight into what you should know before you pick up that console. And then coming up, we have maybe 2 more uploads again. I do know we have a very long one coming up very soon with good old Terrell Smith there, me and my best friend. We are now looking at the PlayStation 2 launch lineup. We've done this so far for PSP and PS3. PS2, as you might know, has a huge launch lineup, 29 games. So we spent a lot of time playing all those titles, and we will be going through them very soon. So I think that upload should be coming up this week. So be on the lookout for that, and then maybe one other video as well. But otherwise, that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.